Thanks, everybody. Yeah, I'm not sure whose idea was it for me to go behind Amanda, but she gave a great talk. But anyway, hi, everybody. Like I mentioned, I'm Sheena Erete. So this paper is actually based on this presentation is actually based on a paper that I co-wrote with my collaborators, Dr. Yolanda Rankin, who's at Emory University, and Jaquita Thomas, who's at Auburn University. And this is one of the papers that we presented last year at HCI, and I was supposed to give a plenary talk last year, but if something happened with the family member and I wasn't able to come here. But this paper, it really is focused on how do we create methods for researchers and scholars to really think critically about how we approach HCI, how do we approach the design of technologies, and really understanding that in the context of solely computing, like overall. So we hope that these approaches will impact like computing education, et cetera, and how we design these experiences in computing education, but also like in HCI and technology, like understanding the design of technologies, but also how we, so the design of technologies and also how we understand technologies. And so, and then I wrote this paper as a researcher too, like reflecting on my experience doing research. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And so, let's see, what else do I want to say? All right, so this really started when we have this notion of civil unrest, right? We have the pandemic, we have civil unrest, we have wars, we have all of these things happening. And honestly, it can feel really, really overwhelming, at least for me. And the results of these issues tend to be extended or really, really like focused on because of existing racial inequities and racial, economic and social disparities, et cetera. And so even as Black women, scholars, we're feeling the ramifications of this more than ever, right? So Black women have been at the forefront of activism in many, many ways, et cetera. And while we're at the forefront of this types of transformation and activism for marginalized group, we're also even more recently have been at the forefront of thinking about the transformation of HCI. And this has trickled over into our field where we've seen Black women be at the forefront of really trying to critically examine the methods that we use in the field of HCI, and thinking about how do we really address like working with historically marginalized groups. How do we address issues of context? How do we address issues of dissecting and understanding like systems of power? And so, and I define power as I refer to it as being able to achieve what you want or your will, despite whatever resistance that you might face from others, right? And because of our intersectional identities, me and my collaborators, especially in terms of race and gender, as Black women, we're subjugated to a very different reality, just in the context of life, but also in the context of like being HCI researchers, what we focus on, et cetera. And so, you know, we have this type of hyper visibility, but also this invisibility that we found kind of in CSCW. We've published about that in other papers as well. And so this work really focuses on how do we use theories from things like Black feminist thought, et cetera, and these types of epistemologies or ways of thinking that are rooted in really Black liberation, specifically led by Black women, and thinking about how can we change or transform the approaches that we use for HCI. And so Black feminism is centers the experiences of Black women, acknowledging this collective group of Black women are not a monolith, so not every Black woman has the same experience, and acknowledging that difference, but also affirming like that these different experiences could speak to how all of us can begin to approach and navigate our existence. And so Black feminist epistemologies have been used as a critical framework in HCI before, and you know we're at the forefront. But really, in that work that I that me and my colleagues have written before, it really focuses on understanding the historical context of the people that we're working with, right? So understanding those systems of power. And these types of methods can be used really by HCI researchers and designers and practitioners, et cetera, to really understand what are the sites of violence that exist, and how do we begin to transform or change those experiences. And so for the intersectional analysis of power, which this paper presents, it really presents a 5-step method for us to think through it, and it's focused in or based on Black feminist epistemologies. And I'll also mention that Black feminist thought is actually by emeritus faculty here at University of Maryland, Patricia Hill Collins, who's very, very famous in sociology and in gender studies. And so the first step is identifying saturated sites of violence. The second one is identifying intersecting systems of power and who holds power and who's in charge and how does power move. And then the next thing is, after you understand how power moves, you understand what's the glue that kind of binds these systems and allows these systems to work. The fourth step is understanding what are the ways in which these groups and organizations are subjugated or surveilled, et cetera. And the last one is, how do we actually resist these things, right? How do we as researchers go about actually resisting these sites of power? And so, again, I mentioned earlier, this work kind of came out of an autoethnographic reflective process that we use. So I used autoethnography. We used testimony authority to really reflect on a project. And the project that we talked about in this particular paper is about street peace, where we design mobile technologies with street outreach workers. And those street outreach workers really focus on community safety and how do we engage in designing tools that support their efforts as folks who are on the ground working on gun violence, those types of things. And so going through this reflection of the process of working with this organization over 3 years, we started with the project framing all the way to the methods, to how do you collect and analyze data, to how do we publish, et cetera. And so I'm going to talk about one of those things, which is really the project framing and the partnership and the funding and how we got it funding, et cetera, and the challenges with that. And so the first step, you take the first step of this, right, which is identifying the sites of violence and really reflecting on it. It was really these traditional approaches. So how did this project come about? And so the way that this project came about is because the community organization actually came to me, but I had already been doing work in this community and they wanted to try to build out these tools, et cetera. But what they found was that the history of doing research with collaborating with academic researchers has been harmful. And so there was a lot of trust building that had to happen over 6 to 8 months, et cetera. And because problems had traditionally been framed by researchers that come into a community, et cetera. And so that is one of the examples of the sites of violence that kind of emerged from that. And then negative personal interactions with researchers who tend to be in power, as well as those who are funding or philanthropic organizations that tend to fund this work. And then how the research is actually funding, the mechanisms of funding the research, which include the fact that they don't typically, there's some places that make it very difficult for community organizations to apply for funding. And if so, it's very small amounts, which require a lot of administrative support to actually write the grants. But then also for $25,000, you spent tons of time and energy and effort in order to get, for them $25,000, which is not a ton, et cetera. And so the second step is understanding the systems of power. And so looking at the history of the communities in which we were working in, we had racism, sexism, classism, ageism, as Amanda mentioned, but also with researchers, and this goes into with researchers and the funders, right, who hold power. The third step is describing the conception of glue, right? So what are the things that kind of connect these, which is this initial, the initial engagement with community, which has been in this deficit oriented way of working with lower income communities, et cetera, are valuing And then the second one is valuing particular ways of knowing. So even when community organizations had something meaningful to say, it being dismissed, including like how funding should happen. So including from the technologies that are built, but also the practices in creating those technologies, et cetera. The use of the resources and who decides who gets to use the resources and how. When the University of Maryland says they're going to take a certain percentage of our grants, they do. But the community organizations don't get a negotiated part in that, right? In deciding on how indirects are used, et cetera. But also the models of funding. So a lot of times, historically, funds would come into a big institution and the sub-award would go to the community organization, right? That's more like, even though the funders, they were like, we typically give the money to the academics and then you all kind of distribute it, et cetera. But those funding models tend to kind of boost up these biases, et cetera. Step 4 was examining the ways in which dominant groups are subjugated or surveilled. And we're talking about community-based safety and methods of thinking about safety. And so the community organizations and street outreach workers that I was working with, they were working over in areas or communities that were over-policed. You have the prison industrial complex where you have a mass incarceration of lots and lots of Black and brown people, which we know that in this country we have a problem with, et cetera. And then the disinvestment and limited investment of city resources, et cetera. Other things are including like the control of resources by researchers, which I mentioned earlier, or by the research team, and then the limited funding sources to support this type of work. Oh, and then the large administrative burden for small funding, and I had mentioned that earlier. And then as an act of resistance, so the types of ways that we resisted these things was we really, for us to reflect on, if this is how power works and this is how you do research, what can I do as a researcher to make sure that it doesn't at least try to mitigate some of these harms, right? And so one way was elevating other modalities of knowledge sharing. So we use things like storytelling and put that at the center of not just how we design the technologies that we built, but also how are we going to do this research, and how are we going to go about collecting the data, framing the project, how do we actually share, et cetera. And also, like, where do we publish? So the community organizations, I don't know if it's obvious to us academics, but they're not reading academic journals and conferences, et cetera. But they were other practitioner-based places where they wanted to share this information, et cetera. We use asset-based community engagement where the community organizations define what are the strengths in your community organization, what are the assets in your community, and then they were able to, by defining that, they get to decide on how we leverage that in the research process, but also in the technologies and the use of those technologies. We engage in lots of reflection and reflexivity throughout the process of working, even at the beginning of the project framing, et cetera. We also created processes to say, we're going to check in this often, not just on the project, but how do you feel about the project, et cetera. We try to engage in equitable and sustainable partnerships, really thinking about, so for example, at the beginning of the project, I had already worked with the community organization to determine what would sustainability look like for them, and that was transfer of intellectual property to them. And so I worked with general counsel at the university to transfer the intellectual property of the technology as well as the code base. And then the other thing is elevating and integrating community voice through project and engagement, et cetera, really thinking about their voices at the center of it, enacting communities like wants, needs, and desires, and really trying to think about a collective way to gather what those needs are or those wants, their desires are. And then for the papers that we published, as well as in the academic conferences and the journals, as well as in the practitioner conferences, they were co-written, where community organizations gave lots of feedback about our papers, also about the process of this paper writing thing too, which was another thing that we thought a lot about. But we did a lot of co-writing, and we did the co-writing of that as well as the grants. So we co-wrote the grants. We also, even in getting the grants, I did a method where we flipped some of the grants. We had several grants to fund this type of work over the 3 years. Some of the grants came directly to us as the academic institution and then sub-awards to them. But then on their side, we also made sure that they were the lead PI and we were the sub-awardee. So really thinking through how could that be. and then that was including community partners as PIs on the grants. So I talked a little bit about, and all of those decisions were made up front, right? The problem framing. In the paper, it gives more about it breaks down these 5 steps and these other methods. So like the methods, data analysis, implementation, etc. And so to conclude, the point I'm trying to make is that there's a need that we should really think intersectionally about our identities and the communities that we work with. And it should be embedded in not just the technologies that we create, but also how we approach the design process. And it can be embedded throughout. And so in order to do that, we need to attend to what's the history of the institutions that we're coming from, meaning like what's the harm that these places have caused. And we need to think critically about how can we shift areas of power. And another point I want to make is that it's really important that we think about celebrating the folks that we work with. So in my case, celebrating and centering Blackness by examining like what, and one of those reasons could be also examining like, why are we doing this work? Why are we working with these particular communities? But really putting the community's needs ahead of our own. So the publishing and practitioner places, really thinking about sharing our work in ways that we may not have shared our work is an example of us putting their needs first, et cetera. And even in the research questions that we design, that they co-design with us. And the last one is intersectionality. It's really, really complicated. So I'm talking about this work over 3 years, and it sounds like, oh yeah, of course you would obviously do that. But, or maybe not so obvious, I don't know. But it's really complex. So if you want to go through these steps, it's a good way for us to think through what are the complexities of working with these particular groups and populations, and how can we treat knowledge, particularly knowledge of marginalized groups, as legitimate and valuable, and integrate that into not just the tools that we create, but also the practices and policies that we use. All right, that's all I got. Thanks.
Thank you, Sheena.